This is an interview with Cameron Mann. We're located in the wonderful town of
Long Beach, Mississippi,
at the University of Southern Mississippi Conference Center. The date is Sunday, September 11th, and it's 9:20 in the morning. Good morning, Cam.
Good morning, Linda.
Thanks so much for agreeing to take time to talk with me today about your work in landscape architecture. It's a privilege for me to have a chance to chat with you in this way. I wonder if we could begin with some background information.
Right.
Where were you born?
I was born at Russell, Manitoba.
Mm-hmm. And that was in?
February 25, 1935.
Uh-huh. Not too many years ago.
No, it doesn't seem that long ago.
Did you do your schooling in Russell? Your early schooling?
Yes, I went to Russell schools until grade 11, at which time my family had moved to Winnipeg, and I completed my high school education at Kelvin High School in Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. And then as a career, I was aimed at medicine, so I went to at that time, what was called United College, now the University of Winnipeg, for a year, and during the course of that time became particularly excited by architecture and started to lose interest in going into medicine. And so I entered the University of Manitoba the following year in architecture. My family didn't really know about it until they saw my grades at Christmas time, and they wondered why a pre-med student was taking drawing and architectural courses, but that was fine. So I went from there to the University of Manitoba.
And studied architecture and graduated in
1959. Spring of 59.
Uh-huh. And who were some of the people you studied with in that program?
Well, probably John Russell, who was the dean of the school, is the most memorable person. Mm-hmm. John Dean was a giant, or Dean Russell was a giant among the architectural educators and architects in Canada. However, there were 2 or 3 faculty members I recall that influenced my education immensely. Jim Donahue, one of the fine architects who had studied on the Eastern Seaboard. A couple of younger fellows who came in and then out, Chester Stovall. Another one that comes to mind was John Graham. John Graham.
Graham.
Yes. John was a unique individual. He taught fundamentals of design and was a legend in the school. He was always called Pinky Graham.
Graham, John Graham.
Yes,
okay.
Pinky Graham.
Yeah, I had him as a professor.
And he was a superb teacher and concentrated on basics and understanding the basis of our, I believe my design base was heavily influenced by John Graham. And one year we had a young fellow from Austria, Wilhelm Holzbauer. Holzbauer was a character of the first order. He had received graduate education at MIT and just spent 1 year in Manitoba. He hated it with a vengeance. He was a very metropolitan kind of fellow, and he went back immediately to Vienna and was still practicing there. So they had real influence on me in architecture.
And then, did you work for the provincial?
Yes, after my first year in architecture, I was fortunate enough to get a student job in the provincial architect's office under, at that time, a gentleman by the name of Gilbert Parfitt. Gilbert Parfitt was an English architect who had immigrated to Canada in the early part of the 20th century and had practiced and ultimately became provincial architect. And he was of the old school architects and understood the classic orders and Gothic work, and not really what we were doing in school, but he was an artist and a great watercolorist as well. And I must say that he understood what I consider to be one of the most important things, his responsibility to the next generation of architects. And he insisted that I get proper training and education at his office. Not that he did not look at me as an employee. He looked at me as an intern. So I worked there for 2 summers and under both Gilbert Parfit and then the subsequent provincial architect, a man by the name of Basil McPherson, who had been with Mr. Parfit, I think, since the Depression years. So they were a wonderful pair of tremendous, technically competent people. Traditional design, but very competent people.
What were some of the things that they were working on? Do you remember any?
Oh, yes. At the time, first summer I was there, they were doing a new major hospital unit for Portage la Prairie for the Manitoba School, which was essentially an institution for children with pretty advanced mental disabilities and shortcomings. Also at that time, they were starting to do the architectural work for Falcon Lake, which was a provincial park. And there were some very fine buildings designed by Sam Sims in that office, which are still, I think, relevant. They were done in the vernacular of the area, Falcon Lake area, done in the native stone, and they were wonderful park structures in terms of interpretive centers, service centers, picnic centers, etc. And I think, looking back on it, that's where I began to have an interest in a broader scale than architecture, because we were working in this park setting. So other things they were doing at that time, they were working on the Selkirk Mental Institution. They also, during my time as a student there, we did the minimum correctional institution at Headingley. Also, the Provincial Architect's Office was doing, and I got to do job supervision on the Natural Resources Building in Verdun. So they had a range of work from courthouses to jails to hospitals, and some more exciting things like the park work they were doing. Also, at that time, they were doing the structures for the Trans-Canada Highway and the Trans-Canada Highway structures. And I recall working on the one at Brandon, and I also recall working on the one just near Portage la Prairie that's now called Northway Park. And I actually feel that I actually got to design some of the picnic shelters, which were, I think for their time, very exciting. We were trying to do them in terms of their function rather than in the classic Parks Canada approach, which was overly rustic in my opinion, and I think a wee bit hokey. It was very different what the provincial parks were doing. They were, at that point, under Sam Sims' guidance, they were doing contemporary design, and I think it was solid contemporary design.
Wonderful.
Okay.
And so then you decided to, what was the big decision to go into landscape architecture? How did that happen?
Well, it happened through a very interesting phenomena. The old buildings that sat in front of the provincial capitol, the Parliament buildings, it's called, a legislative building, had been the university during the war years. And buildings were outdated, and the university had essentially moved to the Fort Garry campus. And they'd torn down those buildings, and they had this big triangle of land, which formed the forecourt for the legislative buildings. And somehow they came upon the idea of making Memorial Park. And I had just graduated at the time, and I got the park to do. I think essentially because there were other things going on in the office, and it just happened to come as a routine assignment. So Memorial Park for me was quite an experience because it was essentially a landscape architectural project, an area that I'd had no specific training. And we went ahead, and I think actually I started, of course, in research mode, going into the library and looking at parks and park design, trying to find out what I could about it, because I was faced with the reality of it. And just as we were doing that work, City Hydro decided that they would make a contribution of this lit fountain routine to acknowledge their 50th anniversaries, I think it was. I can't recall precisely. But nonetheless, we had this enormous fountain, so we wound up with an enormous pool, size somewhat determined by the spray of this enormous pool, or fountain that in those days didn't. It was a synchronized controller system, so that it goes through various waves of light and jets, and you can't. It wasn't sophisticated enough to deal with wind variation, so we knew that the spray would be substantial when it was at its full force. And to a certain extent, that created the need for a very big pool. We did a very interesting design, I think, and that one, I was left totally alone because no one in the office really wanted to get involved. They just didn't feel comfortable with it. And I felt uncomfortable with it because I had never done major park work. I think the outcome of that, some things worked, and if one thing worked for me, it convinced me of my need for further education. But we had come up with a fairly interesting design, I think, and unfortunately we ran into, and it was approved and we were set to go, and as we started excavations for a rather large concrete structure which needed fairly substantial foundations, as I recall, dimensions were about 140 feet across by 160 on the main pool, and consequently required some substantial structures. As we started to excavate, we found the debris of former stables of the old Fort Osborne, which had been a military center, and there had been a creek that had come down from approximately the location of Hudson Bay and went down through the Great West Life Site into the Assiniboine. And the Army had used the creek as a landfill for their stables. And we ran into a valley, which we didn't know was there, that was full of manure and discardings. As a result, we had to excavate most of the site down to a great depth, and we ran into silt pockets, and it was just a most unfortunate site. And what happened is that part of the budget for the structures, or for the overall site, wound up in hauling away most of the site and replacing it. And we spent a summer in there basically excavating and refilling. Net result is that the final design had to be modified, and at the present time it's flat-topped, when in essence, apart from having a crenellated edge, not really crenellated, but an edge that has variation, we had height variation on the sidewalls, and we ran out of funds, and so all the sidewalls are at the same height, which I think really detracts from the design. Nonetheless, during the course of that, I applied to the province for the right to do graduate work in landscape architecture. And I was, of course, expecting them to assist in this matter. Well, our deputy minister at the time was an engineer, and he didn't see the need of this, and I was turned down. So I thought I was a touch bitter about it. So I, at that time, started looking elsewhere, and I accepted a job as an architect in Jamaica, working for McMorrison Sibley. And I went to Jamaica, and I worked there for approximately a year and did some very exciting things. Had a chance to work on the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation building, a series of rather nice houses on the Oricabessa coast, up near Ocho Rios. Had an opportunity to work on a series of banks in Nova Scotia and banks of Canadian Imperial Banks of Commerce, which were prevalent in Jamaica. During that time, I applied for scholarship at Rice University in Texas, William Marsh Rice Institute in those days, now Rice University. And I applied there because there were a couple of architects there that were doing broader things, particularly Bill Cadill, the founder of the large architectural firm in Texas, Cadill, Rowlett, and Scott, who ultimately became CRS Cyrene, or CRSS as they are now. And also at that time, there were a series of other architects, Anderson Todd, who's still at Rice, and a fellow by the name of Ransom, that were doing things in visual language that I was excited about. So I still hadn't made the move into landscape architecture, but I went back to graduate school in architecture at Rice. And after a full semester, I realized that graduate work in architecture was more of the same, perhaps more depth, but it was not what I was looking for. So I returned to Winnipeg at that time and went to work for George Stewart, who I had known as a student, partially because George used to teach a construction course in the department, and worked with him for a period of time. George was a fascinating architect. He was a very competent architect, to say the least. And we worked on the Salvation Army senior citizen home, four of us. George, of course, ran the firm, and his trusty assistant, Mert Purslow, and myself, and then an architect who was brought in just to assist in that project, a man by the name of McMillan, who's been in a partnership with Kotelnikoff and Lewis, and they had apparently did not have a lot of work at the time, and McMillan came in to work on it. At the end of that time, while I was working there, I got married, and my wife and I decided to look at longer-term career, and at that time made a commitment that I was going to go to graduate school in landscape architecture. And I'd been reading during this period of time and had started to recognize names like Garrett Ekbo and Thomas Church, and even starting to understand something about the history of landscape architecture. I applied to 3 schools: Harvard, Penn, and University of California, Berkeley. I got acceptance at Harvard and at Berkeley. And the acceptances came through approximately the end of February. And the end of February in Winnipeg can be a very miserable time. And basically looking at them, both schools looked excellent, and my reputation. And I was looking at it, and I said to my wife and I discussed which one I would go to. And I recall the evening we were making the decision. It was a rather cold snap. It had dropped down to about 36 below zero. And it was Boston or California. And we made the decision to go to California. Interestingly, I never even got a response from Penn. And I've mentioned that to Ian on 1 or 2 occasions. Of course, he has no idea what happened, but I never got a response from him. So we left for Berkeley in a Volkswagen bus with our worldly, well, it's actually a Volkswagen Beetle with our worldly possessions in the Beetle. And arrived winter term in '63 at Berkeley. Neither of us, my wife didn't have work, and of course, and we didn't have scholarship at the time. So she found a job working for, she was an interior designer, and found a job working for an interior design firm in San Francisco. And by spring, feeling comfortable enough, I started working part-time, as most of my colleagues at the time did. It wasn't uncommon at Berkeley for the graduate students to work part-time as well as go to school. And I interviewed, having discussed it with one of my faculty member or professors, suggested I go have a talk with Bob Royston. And I was interviewed by Eldon Beck in the Royston office and hired. And I then worked there for a period of time. The rest of the time I was at graduate school, from 10 to 20 hours a week, depending on the workload in the office, and then also full summers. And had the pleasure of working under that group of people, Bob Royston in particular, and had an opportunity to work with Asa Hanamoto and consistently with Eldon Beck. And I have the highest regard for all 3 of those individuals and the contributions they've made. The exciting part of working there is that the range of work they were doing at that time. They were doing a lot of campus planning, and it was still in the days of the 701 urban renewal. And they were doing major urban renewal projects in places like Tacoma, Washington. And I got the opportunity to work on one of the foothill campuses is a community college, and there are two of them. The original one was done by Sasaki, and then the second one, the Anza campus in Cupertino, was done by Royston's firm in conjunction with the architect Ernest Kump. And that became my major project in the office. And it was a fascinating campus because we were working with an old wine estate, and the wine estate house was going to become sort of the student union, and part of the classic garden there had been done by Thomas Church, and we were designing a new campus around this property. The family name, I can't recall the family name, but it was the Beaulieu Vineyards, and it's now the Gdańsk campus. It was a wonderful experience. I spent approximately 9 months to a year on that in the design phase and the master planning, and working with the people in Kump's office.
Was Royston a landscape architect?
Yes, he was.
So
Yeah.
this was a landscape architectural firm
Yes,
that you were
yes.
working with?
All three of the men I mentioned, Bob Royston, Asa Hanamoto, and Eldon Beck.
Okay. And who were some of the people that you were studying with at that time? Who
Well,
were some of the teachers?
At that time, when I went to Berkeley, H. Leland Vaughn was still the department head. Punk Vaughn, as he was called, one of the grand old men. Very close friend of Thomas Church and Geraldine Knight Scott and the California school people. And he was near retirement at that time, and he certainly was one of the major movers of landscape architecture in California. Burton Litton taught construction, which sounds interesting. Michael Laurie was in his first year as a freshman teacher. Robert Perrin, who now has had for many years a very successful practice in Portland, Oregon. And most exciting for me, Garrett Ekbo was teaching design course. And people that they tended to bring into the department of Berkeley in those days stick in my memory. G.B. Jackson, who used to spend part of his winter at Berkeley. Brilliant thinker. I first met Hideo Sasaki, who came as a guest critic. Met people like Halpern, and who were critics at the time. Actually, Halpern was still teaching a course at Berkeley at that time, and Thomas Church, of course.
Did you find that there was a significant difference in the design philosophy at Berkeley from Manitoba?
I would say it's a wee bit difficult to compare design philosophy and architecture with landscape architecture, particularly considering the 60s. Architecture at Manitoba had been very Bauhaus oriented and was very much into international style. CIAM and Mies van der Rohe was almost worshipped in the school. Because many of our faculty at Manitoba had either studied at IIT under Mies van der Rohe, Marley Blankstein in particular, and Doug Gilmore had studied at MIT at the time, and of course Gropius was still at Harvard at the time. And so the architectural styles did not believe in regionalism. This was the era of the Seagram building and the Crown building, periods of time when we still looked at the Barcelona Pavilion as being the epitome of design. It was a very strong Bauhaus school, in my opinion, at that time. We still did craftsmanship in doing wood jointery as student projects. We looked at Mies as very clean. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright was not even considered to be, he was considered as somewhat eclectic. Because this was mainstream international style, less is more. So I don't think you can compare that kind of philosophy to a landscape architecture school, because I don't think we ever went through that kind of foolishness in landscape architecture. Berkeley at that time was very much California school, no question.
What does that mean?
All right.
I think the question we were just on was the California school. What was that? What was the design philosophy there?
The California school, I think, is misunderstood by many people. I think many people think of it as just the work that was done in California. In reality, I think what it comes from is essentially Thomas Church's work. He was not alone. There were others involved, Cornell and some of the Geraldine Knight Scott and some of the landscape architects functioning in Southern California. But Thomas Church in the Bay Area felt very strongly that external space and internal space should flow together, and that he started talking about outdoor rooms and the idea that the space was shouldn't be a wall between the two, literally or in some cases even physically. And the California climate lent itself to this idea of a flow of space from the interior to externals. So they tended to expand the rooms out into the spaces. Each room expanded out into its landscape. Californians tend to live outdoors and spend more time outdoors because of the temperance of their climate, and they entertain outdoors, and so they started to evolve the outdoor rooms. It's not a unique idea. Church had traveled extensively in the Mediterranean and was familiar with these issues, so he understood the importance of it, and he was a major influence. And some of the younger students, people like Ekbo, were obviously watching what was happening in California, and they were at Harvard doing graduate work and became somewhat upset with what they were being taught in more formal design at Harvard. In fact, to the point where they, as a group, decided they weren't going back. The net result was there were changes at Harvard, and Christopher Tunnard was brought in. But in that group, Garrett Ekbo, John Simons, Dan Kiley, Fran Village, James Rose, a pretty impressive group of individuals who ultimately a group who've had a tremendous influence on the evolution of landscape architecture in the United States. Many of those people are still alive and still having a major impact. Dan Kiley, Garrett Ekbo is still practicing. Unfortunately, Dick Merrick is not. He died recently. But they were a very influential group, and they went to different parts of the country and set up their practices. So really, what had been happening in California and Thomas Church and Ekbo started to spread out in a new attitude, new approach.
How can you take, I'm very curious, because one of the people who I've interviewed on this project is Roman Fodchuk.
Mm-hmm.
And Roman studied at Berkeley.
Yes, he did.
And then came back to Canada. In fact, not even just to regular Canada, but to Ottawa.
That's right.
And I have a question. How does that kind of design, how does that design philosophy that would have permeated his work at Berkeley, how does that impact what he would do in Canada?
Well, there are many issues
or
of
even
it.
for yourself.
For instance, the very old issue, and I don't think it's that critical, but the idea of axial design as opposed to non-axial, and classically formal design induced axial design. The Californians did not use that, and I would think that would be evident in Roman's work, as I understand it. Roman wasn't the only fellow that had gone to Harvard and studied under that group of people. Victor Janasic had studied there. Jack Walker had studied there. At Berkeley. And
Gary Hildeman.
Yes, in a later time.
Mm-hmm.
And John Lancius.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the Canadian landscape architects got their, Clive Justice, got their education at Berkeley. And as a result, a particular group of Janasic, Fodchuk, and another fellow with the National Park Service, I can't remember his name, had all studied at Berkeley just about the time Jack Walker had studied there. So I came about a year after them at Berkeley.
But Jack Walker, there's a good example in the middle of Saskatchewan and, 40 below winters. How does this really, I'm trying to understand a physical relevance here.
Well, it's principles of design. They taught design, and they were very site-oriented and understanding the site and being responsible for it. Even though Geraldine Knight Scott and May Arbogast taught plant materials and planting design, particularly May was cognizant of the fact that the graduate students she was dealing with came from all over the world, and they couldn't go back and just use California plants, even though she did teach those extremely well. And I'll always remember May Arbogast. She taught us to look at plants relative to their environs and look at them in terms of their characteristics. What are you expecting that plant to do? And if you understand those principles, wherever you go, you know what the principles you're looking for, and then you find competent advice as to the appropriate plants that will do that. Mm-hmm. So they were, and I think also California's design school was still very exploratory and open, and Canada was a clean slate for many of us, particularly Western Canada, because there were not a lot of precedents. So there'd been some early work, but there really wasn't an ongoing landscape architectural tradition in Western Canada. If there was any tradition, it was sort of the homestead and the English horticultural tradition. People like Dr. Leslie in Winnipeg, who dominated the scene for a long time, and he was purely a horticulturalist, in my opinion. Anyways, the California school, I think, did have a real influence on Western Canada. The Harvard people came later, with one exception, John Russell, or David Russell from Calgary, who had gone off to Cornell after he finished architecture to study landscape architecture. And David really hadn't practiced that much. He became a politician, and of course, ultimately was a minister in the government in Alberta. But there hadn't been much. The Western people, and all the people we've mentioned, were Westerners. Justice, Chinasik, Fodchuk, Walker, myself, Hilderman. We were all Westerners, and we had gone to California. The one exception of that group, Hilderman's group, is Doug Patterson, who had gone to Michigan, but that was a bit unusual at that time. In Eastern Canada, the Eastern Seaboard was more attractive area, or at least it seemed to be more appropriate. So I think that what happened in Western Canada was heavily influenced by what we picked up in California. And I think just living in the environs of San Francisco, if you have your eyes open and are a designer, there are just so many examples. And I would say this for Berkeley in those days. They got us out into the field. We used to have to do trips into Yosemite, which I look back on and think that that was an absolutely wonderful experience for a person who grew up in the prairies in Manitoba to be required to go on a 10-day backpacking trip into Yosemite Valley was an experience in understanding. And I think nowadays we realize we have to get our students out into the field and to really love nature and understand it in order to be competent designers. That was inherent at Berkeley. And we were taken to unique landscapes, and I don't think we had terminology for it. It was just understanding landscape and understanding land and man's relationship to it. And I think it was wonderful training, and it's not a bad model, in my opinion, even yet.
So would you say that was the basis, the philosophy behind the design curriculum then, was understanding?
Yes, very much so. They still taught technical things, more so than perhaps they do at this time. Bert Litton taught grading and drainage and construction and road alignment, and May Arbogast and Geraldine Knight Scott definitely taught planting design, somewhat in the formal fashion. But again, think of this, in the early 60s, Geraldine Knight Scott was talking about xeriscapes, the idea that you deal with water, those plants that have limited water requirements, that you understand that the shape of the land, that the plants that require the most water are going to be down at the bottom of the slope. And she was preaching, and I would say proselytizing, the idea of appropriate and particularly xeriscapic plants.
Which isn't so far off when you think of the environment within which she was. If she was sensitive to that, that is a very dry climate.
Right.
But as you say, for the 60s, it was pretty.
Well, her point was it was a desert. Yeah. It was particularly the Los Angeles basin, the Santa Barbara area, where she had practiced. was a desert. She said, but for water, this is a desert. And of course, the prevailing attitude at the time was, but yes, but we have water, so we can create the paradise that we want it to be. Yeah. And she was proven right in the long run, but she preached, and at times most of us looked somewhat askance at her because we understood irrigation, and we just seemed to think that perhaps Geraldine had not figured out irrigation yet. In reality, she had much more vision than we gave her credit for at the time. And I think H. Lynn Vaughn felt very strongly that he was a colleague of hers for a long time, and I think he understood that. But if you look at the church landscapes, he was a very practical man. He had landscapes that were native landscapes, and he used plant material with just unbelievable, to me even yet, his sensitivity to plants and their appropriateness. But he also used irrigation. In other words, he was not a purist about that. Same as in his design. He was not a purist. He was very functionally oriented with a wonderful background in pure design, understanding design principles, and then adapting them to the particular site very attractively. So I think that the California School had a tremendous impact on Western Canada and the landscape architects of Western Canada. I do too. Anyways, after school, and we were talking about that, my graduate thesis had a chance to work on the floodway in Winnipeg, its recreational potential, which still hasn't actually been developed, but it was a great idea at the time. And I had Garrett Ekbo as an advisor, and I still think of that as one of the great experiences of my life, the opportunity to have him as my personal advisor for thesis, along with an interesting architect, the name of George Matsumoto. But I worked at Royston's until I graduated, and shortly thereafter, in a great range of projects, apart from the ANZA campus, got opportunities to work on some unique housing developments when they were developing what were not at that time, didn't have specific names, but there'd be planned unit developments in today's terminology on places like Peacock Gap and so forth. These were fairly dense, common space kinds of developments. Also had a chance to work on some of the most, or not chance, worked with Bill Coates in that office, working on some of the public housing of that era. And I recall one particular project in St. Louis that we worked on, and there were so many changes on this miserable thing that became known in the office as a racing shield terrace, because we were constantly changing on these linen drawings at the time, government documents, with electric erasers removing ink, and the buildings moved like they were in jelly. And so that was not great work, but a great range of things in that office that were of wonderful education for a landscape architect. Anyways, I heard through the grapevine at the time that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill had just received the commission to work on the Washington Mall, to do a new plan for the Washington Mall, essentially as a preliminary step to having the mall declared a national park. Prior to that, the mall had been part of the District of Columbia, and its maintenance level had degenerated, and there was a real move under the Johnson administration, particularly Lady Bird Johnson, to have the mall brought up to national significance. And I applied for a job there and got a job, and I worked at, started January 1, I believe, and I guess in 64, working at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And I've spent about less than a month working on a series of other projects because the mall project was just getting into gear. One of those was the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, which was a wonderful grading project and planting project, because it's basically a bowl that goes down in, and they took the soil to build the mounds on the side. It's a balanced cut and fill kind of thing. It was a wonderful project. And I worked on a series of small things like Container Corporation of America's property and some work in Universal City. But once the mall got rolling, I spent essentially the next 11 months. In fact, I recall the day we had to present, December 17th. And I, of course, could not attend that meeting, which was at the White House, because not being an American citizen, I could not get clearance for the meeting. But the two fellows I worked with, one of Don Tompkins, who ultimately went on with the Sasaki firm, went to do the presentation. It was a wonderful project that essentially 5 of us worked on. And of course, there was input from a lot of people. And this was the preliminary planning for the adjustments in the mall, preliminary to it becoming a national park. During the course of that time, of course, one of the founders of Skidmore, Merrill, Nat Owings, took great interest in this project because of the high profile and because he was personal friends with Lady Bird Johnson, and so he always did the formal presentations, and then the staff would fill in the details. But during the course of that, we had the opportunity of working with Chuck Bassett, who was the chief of design at SOM at the time, a brilliant designer, and helped build SOM's reputation as one of the great architectural firms of the world. And Nat Owings was a personal friend of Dan Kiley's. So Dan Kiley was one of the consultants, and he was hired as a consultant to assist us on this. And so I had the pleasure over about a 3-month period of Dan coming in for a week or so at a time and working on the project with us. And one of his staff, Peter Walker, there are 2 Peter Walkers well known in the field. This one had studied under Ian McHarg. He was a Scottish landscape architect who studied under McHarg and went to work with Dan Kiley. So, as I say, that was our working group, and it was an amazing experience. To spend approximately 11 months on one project and not be the only person on it, but at least 5 people working pretty steady on that over that time, with the input from people like Bassett and Owings, and the stories of Owings are a legend. He was a character. And Kiley and Peter Walker. It was quite an experience, and I had every intention of staying, but when the project was finished for presentation on the 17th of December, I took the opportunity to go home for Christmas. My wife and I drove to Winnipeg to spend Christmas vacation, realizing that when I got back, I would probably be working on Universal City, which SOM were doing at the time in their planning department. And during the Christmas break, of course, met many of my old friends and architects I'd known, and they somehow convinced me that there was a need for a landscape architect in Winnipeg. In fact, there was a landscape architect in Winnipeg at the time. Dennis Wilkinson had come to the university, and I, of course, had known Dennis from San Francisco because he worked at Florence Halpern's office. So we tended to socialize a bit, and so I knew Dennis. But anyways, Dennis was at the university, but they were saying for practice. So we talked about it, and both our families, my wife's family and my family, encouraged us to stay in Winnipeg. So I set up practice, and technically, I guess, about January 3, 1965. Rented a room in the old Lindsay building, Notre Dame, at a very reasonable rate. Got a telephone, had a card table, 2 chairs, which borrowed from my mother-in-law, and I proceeded to buy 2 filing cabinets, and bought a door, and was in business. Fortunately, there was an architect in the building with the name of Louis Plotkin, who was a pretty decent fellow, and he agreed to allow me to have my phone call switched over to him when I wasn't there. So his office was my answering service for the first while, and I appreciate everything Louis did to help. Within a week, I had my first commission. It came in the strangest way. It came from George Stewart, the architect I'd worked for, and he said, "I'm doing some work out at the Mennonite Brethren College in Tuxedo, and their alumni want to make a small contribution out there, and they'd like to have a sign designed to mark the site." He said, "Do you do those kinds of things?" And I said, "Yeah, I suppose I can." And he said, well, here's a fellow's name, give him a call if you're interested. And George was a good technical architect, but he really wasn't interested in doing science, so I don't blame him. So my first commission was the entry sign for the Day Midnight Brethren College. Anyways, I started in that time going around to the various architectural offices, explaining that I was in business and letting them know. And I was overwhelmed by the end of February. I had more work than I could handle. Particularly, Izzy Coop provided work. Specifically, Jerry Libling from Libling Michener. And interestingly, Smith Carter, the Smith Carter firm, Dennis Carter, called, and I got a very small commission, basically to look at a lunch area for their employees in their very Miesian building, which was out in South Winnipeg.
Typically Winnipeg.
But an interesting idea. It was supposed to be an employee's lunch area. But at this time, a fellow I had never met before wandered into the office, introduced himself, and said he was a landscape architect. And he had studied at Iowa, and his name was Seymour H. Bernstein. And Bernie, as he called himself, was working for the Provincial Parks Department. He'd come up from Iowa to be a parks planner, and he hated where he was. He hated the operation because they didn't understand landscape architects. And that's possibly true. Anyways, he said he was looking for a job. And I said, I really was a bit uncomfortable hiring this. I had been in business about 6 weeks at this point. And I had not, had a major commission. I just opened the door and said, okay, I'm going to start. Bernie came in. He said, well, look, if you get busy, I'm bored silly where I am. I can always work evenings if you need any help. Well, within a month, I hired Bernie. And Bernie came to work. It was obvious that I had the workload that needed. And a particular project had come along from Libling Michener's office, the Selkirk Housing Project, which was a CMHC project in North Winnipeg in the area that had been the old Winnipeg Farmers Market area. And it was a fairly massive project, and just the workload on it was enough to keep at least 2 people busy for a significant period of time. At this point, I started looking for Jim Taylor. Jim and I had worked together. We'd been in graduate school. He was a year ahead of me in graduate school at Berkeley. And Jim also had worked at John Kyle Warnicke's office while I was working at Skidmore and Merrill. Warnicke's office was doing the Federal Triangle when we were doing the National Mall. And then Jim wound up over at Royston's, and so we had a lot in common relationships, and we'd always been friends. I knew I was looking for somebody to come and join me in the practice, and I tried to get a hold of Jim and found he was traveling in Europe with Thomas Vint. This is Tom Vint, who's now at Morgan State, but TV2, as he called himself, because his father, Thomas Vint, was chief of design for the National Park Service in the U.S. for a long period of time under Connie Worth, and basically from Mather through to the Contemporary Times. And it took me about 3 weeks to track them down, and I found them and said to Jim, frankly, come through Winnipeg on your way back because I want to talk about partnership. Well, he wasn't quite sure that he wanted to move to Winnipeg, even though he was from Iowa. He knew some of the vagaries of the climate. Anyways, he did come through. We talked, and in the same period of time, he had to go back and clean up his stuff in California, and he agreed to come and be in Winnipeg approximately May. In the meantime, we decided that because we both had worked in these multidisciplinary firms in California, that we were going to probably need others, and we knew of Claude Murray because Claude and I had been fraternity brothers and gone through school together, and he was working in Israel at the time with a high-pressure grouting company, I think, and he was ready to move, and he had indicated he was interested in getting into practice for himself. And Glenn Urquhart, who was another fraternity brother and a very close friend, was busily just finished law at Manitoba. Glenn was a mechanical engineer who then went on into law. And he was working for the city of Winnipeg, chasing welfare bums. Welfare bums, as they called them in those days, was basically fathers who did not pay their child support and people who abused the welfare system. And he did not find this very exciting for an engineer lawyer who had just won in his graduating year, a prize in criminal law, a very bright man. So at a cocktail party at our house one evening, we got talking in the kitchen, and he joined us on the Monday after the cocktail party as a partner. So Bernie and Glenn and I waiting on Jim to arrive, and Claude coming later. So by the first Christmas, we were able to take out, as I recall, $100 apiece out of the firm to look after Christmas. But apart from that, we were not taking any money out of the firm. We did pay Bernie's salary and so forth, but Claude, Jim, Glenn, and myself worked until January that first year, through until December that first year, without drawing from the firm, because we did not put any money in, which was a foolish thing to do, but we didn't take any money out either. Yeah. But by that time in January, we started to be able to pay ourselves. We took a partner's draw. So that was the start of the firm, and it became Mann Taylor. Well, the first one in January was the Office of Cameron Mann. In end of February, it became, or about March, Mann Taylor, Murray, and Urquhart, even though Murray had not arrived yet. And we were that until the time Urquhart left the firm. It was a good combination. Jim, I've always admired his design skills. Claude was a solid businessman, understood how to run a business, and had no compunction about collecting fees if they had to be collected. And Glenn was a lawyer, and he was, as he said, he didn't really enjoy engineering, but he could write contracts, and he was very good at keeping us structured appropriately. Plus, he had a tremendous sense of humor, and there were many times in those early days when that was as important as anything else. Yeah. Glenn ultimately left to go to work for a big firm, a big legal firm, Akins McCauley, in Winnipeg, simply because of family situation. His parents, tragically, his father died when he was on his honeymoon, and before he got back to the funeral, his mother died. I'm not sure, it might have been reversed order, but they both died in a period of about 3 days. And there was a substantial family estate, and Glenn had considerable issues to deal with. He'd also married a very interesting lady, Jack McMahon's daughter. So the net result was he felt he had to look after their personal affairs, so he left the firm. It's interesting because Glenn has gone on in practice, went out to British Columbia to work for, in a very major case, he went to work for Ferris and Ferris, Senator Ferris's firm, who were defending BC Power, BC Hydro, against a series of contractors who built the Bennett Dam, who claimed that the drawings provided by BC Hydro were not adequate. And so Glenn was hired because of his background, interestingly, in engineering, understanding engineering, and being a criminal lawyer, and having even, I think, to a certain extent, had experience in landscape architecture. Right. He now runs a major firm in Vancouver called Singleton Urquhart. They're the biggest construction litigation people in Canada, and they're experts. I'm not sure, it's a 30 to 50 person law firm that specializes in construction litigation, and they also act for Simcoe and Erie, the errors and omission insurance company. But that was one of the partners, and of course, it's another issue. Anyways, we moved on from there, and the roles in the firm worked out that Jim tended to take design. We had to have responsibilities, and he was the design person. He didn't know the local people. He didn't feel particularly comfortable. Jim is a rather shy person, and he didn't feel particularly comfortable going out and beating the bushes looking for work. Claude was quite prepared to do it, but didn't really know what he was selling because he was somewhat at a loss. Glenn, being a trial lawyer, could sell anything regardless of the product. So he didn't have any compunction about going out and selling landscape architectural services. In fact, he found it a challenge. Many funny stories about Glenn. When we were in panic, and we'd have Glenn doing estimating and quantity takeoffs, and we all recall the story of hearing Glenn on the phone talking to suppliers, which wasn't uncommon to get prices. And he said, he was looking at a major park, and he said, could I get a price on a gazebo? And he said, gazebo, Gazebo. And we broke out laughing because he had no idea what a gazebo was. And so he's asked us, do you happen to have a price on a gazebo? Which we found hilarious. But Glenn, because he was a lawyer, he picked up the Latin very quickly, and he used to use the Latin names on plants. He had no idea what the plant was, but he knew all the Latin names. And so we used to have a wonderful time. He added humor to it. But it was a wonderful time because we were, at that time, Glenn did most of the client contact and promotional work. And out of that came some very interesting projects. I think some of the ones that stick in my mind as the most important was our being engaged by the University of Saskatchewan to do major work on the new arts complex. And out of that, we wound up doing a series for a long period of time, a series of, we really tried to talk to the university in doing the full master plan, and they understood but not able to fund it, and they started to fund it in pieces. And by maintaining consistency with the same firm, we ultimately were moving towards, even though it wasn't documented, a master plan. That was important. We also at that time got a commission to do the new student center at the University of Manitoba. And it was fairly major. And then out of it came the sports complex.
The student center at the University of Manitoba?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
The zoo, as it's called, I think, UMSU.
UMSU.
Yeah. Also at that time, the Pan American Games came along, and we did the Pan American Sewing Pavilion. This was with Smith Carter. In Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. But we started to because we knew where our potential clients were, we suspected that the provincial parks departments, the provincial architects' offices, the Wascana Center, those, and of course the engineering firms, were our potential clients. And as it turned out, that was the case. In one particular promotional trip that Glenn and I took, where we visited Medicine Hat and Lethbridge and Red Deer and quite a range of cities, we wound up in Calgary with the parks director and Harry Boothman. Yeah. And he had but it was Providence, he had just received approval to look at a new golf course. And we wound up being in his office while it was fresh in his memory. And even though we had not done a golf course as a firm, I had worked on golf courses through a variety of things, former offices. And anyways, we got the job. And that became a very major project.
That was in Maple Ridge?
Maple Ridge. Similarly, we had the original Princess Island study, and I believe that is still ongoing, but the Princess Island study was an important one.
I bet it's turned out beautifully, I can tell you.
Yes.
It really has. It's a major focus for downtown.
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem at that time was it wasn't the south face was a pretty miserable looking thing, and it really detracted, and Calgary was in a very much of a growth mode at the time, and Harry understood that. So we had a limited budget, but we did the Princess Island study. At the same time, in Manitoba, we got the Hecla Island study.
Which is that?
Hecla, Hecla. Hecla Island is part of the old Icelandic communities up on the lake, and they were starting to put together the Hecla Island as what would now be considered a historic preservation and area. We were looking at it as preliminaries. The study was to identify sites in a new provincial park, and Hecla Island being the center of the old Icelandic communities. And in the process of that, by this time the firm was growing substantially. And I think by the end of the second year, we were up at about 10, 12 people. We brought in, we were at this point consistently robbing offices across the line. And we got Gene Ernst out of Ted Osmundson's office in San Francisco. We got Gene Fulrod for a period of time out of the National Park Service to come up and work on Heckle Island. We proceeded to get a series of people, and Jane Garrison out of Lloyd Bond's office in Eugene, Oregon. And we had to go because at that time the schools were not producing landscape architects in Canada. We were always looking for Canadians who'd gone to school in the U.S., but we didn't find them. Guelph was up and operating at that time, and I think in the first graduating class from Guelph, we hired approximately half of the class. Bela Barabbas, Larry Foster, who's now the director of planning in, I believe, Kelowna or Penticton. Bela Barabbas was with the Mawassan Authority in Saskatchewan, is now with the city planning. I can't recall, I think Larry Patterson was one of the few that we didn't hire out of that first class. And I can't recall why, because we basically needed them. Yeah. But we started hiring people, and a lot of people like Tom Dunbar and Dick Rose and I think some of the others who then went on to set up their own firms in various points in time. Gary Hilderman, Doug Patterson, were all hired more or less in the next 2 to 3 years. In fact, because of the Calgary work, we realized the potential in Calgary, and we set up an office in Calgary. This is a branch office, less than 3 years out of the starting blocks. And the first office was an apartment in which the people working on the golf course, this being Larry Foster, Claude Murray, and design was being done in Winnipeg, but the field work and so forth being on there. And my brother, who at that time was studying landscape architecture at Cal Poly, and he came home to work for the summer. And
what's his name?
Conrad. He's now the Commissioner of Buildings and Grounds for the city of Saskatoon. He didn't finish in landscape architecture. He decided that he was more interested in the administration side, which must run in the family. I have an interest in it. So he finished off in park administration and ultimately spent most of his career with the Vancouver Parks Board, but recently, the last 5 years in Saskatoon. And we rented an apartment in one of those ghastly high-rises in Calgary. I'm talking about the high-rises that popped up in the late 60s. They were pretty shabby things, 20 stories high and no style. Anyways, we had an apartment. And the people lived there and worked there. And ultimately, we got a small office. But that was sort of the start of and we had to learn how to run a branch office. And we devised all kinds of systems, most of which didn't work. We were still concerned with costs, so we would do telephone calls, playing the time rates. We'd have to, any thoughts we had, we'd write them down, because at the 4:00 call on Tuesday, we had to get these all done. And we also moved drawings back and forth in what we used to refer to laughingly as pilot's pouch. We would run these things out to the airport. In those days, Air Canada would take carry-on mail, as it were. And it was consigned, and then someone would meet the airplane and get these drawings, because sending them through the mail was not the way to go. About that time, we started promoting out into Vancouver, and for a variety of reasons. And of course, out of that came our relationship with John Lancius. And ultimately, we met. It was an interesting issue. John had just started to teach as department chair at Ball State, but Don Vaughn and some of the others were running the office in Vancouver. We talked about the idea. We said we'd have sit-down talk with John, because we knew that he was somewhat absentee at the time. And we decided to meet, talk about potential merger. And we met at the Palmer House in Chicago.
Oh, yes.
John, of course, was teaching at this time at Muncie, Indiana, so it was convenient for him. And our people flew to Chicago, and Don Vaughn flew in from Vancouver, and we merged into what became, for a short period of time, Mantaylor Murray, Urquhart. Well, at that time, Urquhart had left. Mantaylor Murray, Lancius, and we used the slash. Brought those together with the understanding that John's concern was not that he didn't appreciate Don's management, but felt that one of the conditions was in the merger that we seemed to be top heavy on partners and principals, and he was short on those, so that the idea that one of us would go there. And as much as I'd spent part of my childhood and various times in Vancouver and had always liked it, Jim had no interest in it, and Claude was very much tied to Winnipeg at the time because his father was ill and he felt obliged to stay there. So the election was that I go to Vancouver. So I wound up in Vancouver with that firm, and I was there until the time I left. During those years, we'd been growing, and that's when we started to develop these relationships. And one of the early relationships was what was called the Lombard Group. We were meeting with resource economists who we'd worked with, and Ron Pellick's operation Create Plan had developed in our office space on Albert Street, but he had a separate company of which we had about, I think, 51% ownership in the first 5 years, and then it switched to us. It was 49, and Jim was 51. And Create Plan, and we had these different groups, and we realized the importance, and I think the issue that I'd like to stress is that we sincerely believed in collaboration and multidiscipline issues. It just wasn't lip service. We really did believe it. And we did it in our hiring of students from a variety of disciplines, as well as in our group. So we used to meet to talk about how we would put this together. And the economists had offices over on Lombard Street. And being economists, they tended to be note takers, Dave Young in particular. And he said, one day, he said, well, what are we calling this group? And we said, we don't know. And he said, well, being as we were meeting in our offices once a week, I don't, for the time being, I'm just referring to it in my notes as the Lombard Group. And ultimately, it became the Lombard Group because they're office on Lombard Street, even though Mantaylor Murray and Create Plan and I'm trying to think of the other plan, these strange names, were all over on Albert Street. But proximity, we could walk back and forth to each other's offices. And the idea was that we'd work that out. And then the understanding was that the Lombard Group would deal also with the Calgary office and the Vancouver office. This was not to be just Winnipeg, it was across. And we were trying to build a corporate structure that would allow several things to happen. Allow us to be sufficiently flexible to approach a broader range of clients and provide a comprehensive service. But also where the units within that could operate independently. In other words, they could take outside work in their particular discipline. They were not tied to just our firm. And I think it was an interesting idea, and we went through tremendous growing pains of trying to learn how to do this. There was not a lot of precedence. I'm talking about a period of time that was probably 1969, 70. And as a result, those kinds of firms weren't around. There were very few of them, at least, especially in our discipline. And it was exciting because we really did. It was synergistic, working with our forestry people, particularly with our limnologists, and because we were dealing with ecological issues, even though we didn't really fully understand, and it wasn't the current. The current understanding of ecology is fairly broad spread. At that time, it really wasn't. So, we need to move on. Anyways, out of that, I was in the Vancouver office, and I'd always had an interest in teaching. In fact, while in Winnipeg, I had part-time taught down at North Dakota State, fly down to Fargo and do 2 days and come back, sort of a visiting critic routine. An opportunity came up. I got a call from Bruce Sharkey, who had been one of our employees. Bruce Sharkey. Bruce Sharkey had left our firm to go back to graduate school at Berkeley, and he'd gone to teach at Cal Poly Pomona, and apparently they were in a chair search, and he'd thrown my name in the bag, and I got the call, would I be at all interested? And I'd always had an interest in teaching and had my ideas about how landscape architecture really should be.
Sure.
And I was accepted for the position as chair at Cal Poly, which is interesting. Chair of the Landscape Architecture Department, full professor, pretty good salary, having never had a formal teaching position. And this would be at the age of about 37. So I felt pretty good about it. So I accepted the position and went to Cal Poly. Now, I did not immediately forego my, that was in 1972. I maintained my interest in the firm for about a year while we figured out how we were going to do the rearranging of all this. Cal Poly was a great experience because I was back into sort of the heartbeat of landscape architecture at the time, California. Some of the great firms, working with some people that I admired, and it was a very interesting time. And Cal Poly was a big landscape architectural firm at the time. About 75, and during that period of time, even though I was the department chair and a full professor, I was on a 9-month appointment. As a result, as soon as June arrived, I headed north. And after I'd parted with Lombard, I went back into practice in Vancouver with a former classmate, Don Erb. And the firm at that time was Hanson and Erb, and they were growing and they needed a planning department. So they tried to encourage me to leave the university and be full-time. And I chose not to, and in retrospect, that was fine, because although they grew tremendously and were involved with the Vancouver General and major hospital operations, ultimately they got caught in I guess it was the 82 crash, and they lost it all. Both now are working for other architects. But that was an experience, because I would come north and work on very large-scale planning things for the summer, and then go back to teaching in the fall. In 75, Owen Scott called me. They were looking for a new director at Guelph. Victor was stepping down at that time. Would I be interested? And I said, well, I was interested, but not particularly excited. And I was interviewed at Guelph and offered ultimately selected as and made an offer, and I accepted it. Guelph, I think, has had a very strong role in landscape architecture in Canada, being the first program, and really it was a real opportunity. So I spent the next 14 years at the University of Guelph, during which time I became very actively involved in professional societies and organizations, and essentially in doing what I'd always done, which is promotion of the profession, whether for my own firm or for the profession in general. So that's sort of where it is until then I'd finished my terms as the 2 terms as director of the school. I was approached by Kelvin Bishop, who I'd met through ASLA when he was president of ASLA, to come down and consider Mississippi State. They were going through some internal problems with accreditation, and they wanted someone who could sort of restructure their department. And on coming to Mississippi State, I was fascinated, as I think many people are when they come to this state. It's not what they expected. And I found that it was a much better situation than I had perceived, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So that's where I am now. I think maybe just talk a few moments about landscape architecture in Canada. I think landscape architecture in Canada has come within my lifetime from being almost a small elitist group to being part of the mainstream. I think landscape architecture is understood in Canada just as well by Canadians as landscape architecture is in the United States by Americans. I think in Canada we sit back and kind of think that, well, Americans are well established and people know who they are. I attend meetings, especially during the period of time I was president of the SLA, all across this country, and the constant whine is people don't know what we do. I've heard that in Canada as well, but I think that landscape architecture is better structured and is well managed, and I think as well understood in Canada, or more so than it is in the U.S. What are the differences? I think the differences are quite evident. I think that the Canadian landscape architects have always been site planners, that we've had to deal with site, with harsh conditions, particularly in the western parts of the country. And we've been very conscious of things like wind and exposure and orientation. And we've been spatial planners and organizational planners. Whereas I think historically in the United States, there was a lot of gardening went on in landscape architecture, enhancement of private and public grounds. That has changed, of course, in the U.S., but there's still a substantial portion of the practice in the U.S. is involved with what I would call domestic scale, and in many cases, planting plans. That does not mean that there haven't been major design projects done by the American landscape architects. But if you stop to think of it, if you think of World Fairs, 86 and 67, if you think of Wascana, an idea way before its time, National Capital Commission's work, think of Parks Canada, the envy of most, even the U.S. park system, because of the resources and also management. Highway improvements done on the Trans-Canada long before the U.S. was doing that kind of thing on their highways. So I think that in many ways Canada's been exemplary. And I think you just need to look at the issues of ASLA awards and publications, and you'll see that the Canadian landscape architects have held up very well in comparison worldwide. In my previous discussion with you, you asked that I think about the 10 most significant projects in Canada. I've sort of covered a couple of them at the moment, but I think that we don't fully appreciate some of the work of Dunnington Grubb. And I think that University Avenue in Toronto is one of those kinds of things. Obviously, the Wascana Centre, in which Thomas Church was one of the advisors, is a significant issue. But I think many of the parks in Canada are significant. In particular, I think in Vancouver of 3 parks. I think of course, Stanley Park. You can't think of Vancouver without thinking of it. But the Van Dusen Gardens, and I think the Queen Elizabeth Gardens up on Little Portage Mountain. I think that our work is not as visible as it may be in the United States, simply because we've been more planners, and I think that's been appropriate for Canada. How's the profession changed? I think we were fortunate that some of our early landscape architects in Canada were planners. In essence, they, by training, may have been landscape architects, but they were broad-scale planners. And I think that that's persisted. We still have, it was important at a time when public perception was of the horticulturalist and horticultural planning. I think the practice has changed in Canada, that we're much more sensitive to the uniqueness of our situation and our climate. And climate controls so much of the country. And I think that the practice has gone from smaller projects to bigger projects. I'm sure that there'll be debate on that issue, but that's sort of my perception. I think the future of the profession in Canada is that we're going to, as a profession, have to deal with many of the regulations that we were instrumental in requiring. Canadians have always had the ability to regulate themselves to death. We have probably some of the most severe requirements on, for instance, the escarpment land, trying to permitting and quality control and so forth. All very important to the common good. But we've all been involved with it saying we really need to have law, regulation, so forth, controls. And I think we're going to see that they're going to strangle us. I'm not suggesting that we abandon environmental quality or anything, but Canadians are overgoverned. They have far too many laws about things that they assume that no one has any common sense. Now, that may be true, but I don't buy that.
It doesn't need to be legislated.
No, you don't have to legislate that. I think landscape architects in Canada are going to become much broader individuals with better scientific base. That's both in the natural sciences and social sciences. The being purely a competent technician is useful, but it's not where the profession's going. And there was a time where if you were a competent technician, there was adequate work. I think in the future you're going to have to be really scientists in the sense of understanding. That doesn't mean we have to be practicing biologists or ecologists. We really have to take that into account. And I think it's going to affect design. And it's not just the physical sciences. I've listened to people like Doug Patterson and Maura Quayle who are doing some cutting edge work on the outside, on the edge. And they're really talking about the social sciences, the cultural issues and the historical issues and so forth. So I think Canada's very fortunate in having strong programs in the universities, good selectivity in their selection of students. And if you look around, we're now seeing Canadian trained landscape architects in major teaching roles in this country and other countries, as we see at this conference. We're exporting landscape architects. When I was starting practice, we imported all our landscape architects. They only went out to get a wee bit of training, some of us, but there was a time when there were more foreign landscape architects in Canada than Canadian landscape architects. And I think that it's interesting that now we're exporting landscape architects into the United States. A personal friend, Tom Papandreou, runs a firm in Honolulu. And I think that every time I meet him, which is usually half a dozen times a year, the first question is, how many now? And it's how many Canadian landscape architects are working for your firm? And then the next question is, how many of them are Guelphites? And I think last time it was something like 11. So, but that's an export. So the schools in Canada, in which most of their people were trained in the U.S. in their graduate work, but have come back and are now turning out people who are going out into the world. And of course, increasingly, Canadians are doing their graduate work in Canada as well, Guelph in particular, but UBC in Manitoba.
Do you see that there's a good future for landscape architects? Do you think that it looks good, or how do you feel about it?
I think there's unlimited possibilities if they are willing to move into the areas they need to be. And I'm not talking geographic, I'm talking about as a profession. If they are going to sit around and wait for the world to come and bring them traditional projects, they won't survive. I think the role of a landscape architect, the one role that we play better than architects, even though the architects try to play it, is the generalist role, that we know how to bring people together. And it goes back to my original thinking when we set up the firm. Two minds are better than one. And if you have two disciplines represented, you get a third, which is that synergy that occurs between, which is neither. But you have to learn how to work with that. And I think if landscape architects must do this all the time. We work on the art side, the design side, we work on the science side, we work on the technical side, we work on the business side. We're thinking about land values and these things while we're in the process of dealing with the wetlands and over here on the aesthetic issues. So we work across those lines. We're not expert at any of them, possibly with exception of being expert in the ability to see a process and evolve a process appropriate to the site. So we're the original regionalists. We are site specific. We are site planners. We deal with that site and determine what's necessary to make that site work. And that's a generalist capability. As I say, unless you want to say a true generalist is a specialist. A specialist being generalization. And I think there is great future there. I see landscape architects going into all kinds of areas that are not, quote, traditional landscape architecture. And I encourage that. It's healthy. We're increasing the clientele base out there. If we as a profession have something to offer, let's offer it not just to the traditional clients, but participate in that broader spectrum.
Where are some of those people going that aren't traditional?
Oh, for instance, I see people going into the financial industries, into the banking industry, where they're dealing with land and mortgage issues. I see landscape architects, particularly in this country, going into what I call the design build management area. I see them going into land management, where they're managing issues. For instance, yesterday, one of the tour guides, Robert Bruzak, he's basically a curator of an ecological unit. I see students going into actually into environmental product development in businesses. A lot of people going into the design build business.
So the design build business, what is that?
Design build, as it's understood here, is generally a person, a landscape architect normally, it should be if it's a licensed state, who is not happy with just doing the design and having someone else do the actual implementation. They want to maintain the design quality through the process, and they then become contractors as well as designers. And they say to a client, I carry it all the way through. And then now they're starting to say, not only do I carry it through design and construction, but I'll undertake maintaining that landscape, which is changing. And so the big design build firms like the Brickman Group in this country have watched their design and construction side of their industry grow, while on the other hand, as they add maintenance and management to that, this is growing at a much faster rate because they're also starting to manage properties that they didn't originally construct. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense. And it's an attitude that you see here that is developing, that as professionals, a duty of care gets involved. We're responsible for what we do, and can we walk away from a project after we've done the design? Technically, we should stay with the project. A doctor normally stays with his patient for the continuation of one or the other for life. And I think this might be the case here, unless, of course, the client moves on or the project changes dramatically, it's torn down and they start new. Probably it should be that relationship. It doesn't mean that we have to do the lawn mowing. It just means that we have a responsibility. And we're seeing development of niche firms down here that are doing exactly that. They offer management service. Let's assume I make toothpicks for a living and run a manufacturing operation. I think I should have my grounds done adequately to be a good corporate citizen. I have a designer. He gets a contractor. It's done. And then I have to go find a gardener or something. I don't know what the original intent was. Now, my business is toothpicks. I want somebody to look after that and charge me a fee. Yeah. And that's what's happening. Firms.
As it grows and changes,
yes.
How does that growth still maintain the original concept?
Exactly. Now, you could have a management firm, and this is where the build firms are coming in. They're coming in on some of these projects, picking them up because the corporations have to have somebody look after it, and they're hiring these maintenance management firms to do it, which is interesting. And so they're building, but in many cases they don't know precisely what the design intent was because they didn't do it. So they're going to their clients and saying, let us do the design, build, and manage. Then we can manage it the way it was designed. And the McDonald's corporation approached Brickman on that basis when they said they wanted to bid on the design, or in other words, put in a proposal on the design and construction. The head of McDonald's said, only if you assure me that if you do build it, you will maintain it. And they said, well, they hadn't really thought about that, but no real problem. So Dick Brickman said he had to promise the head of McDonald's that if he got the contract, he would stick with it as long as McDonald's wished him to. And he said, I am committed to McDonald's as long as they're willing to have us on the site. And I think that's a changing attitude. We're saying that landscapes change, we know that. We can't just go in and do a quick shot and leave and expect that to be responsible. So we're seeing the development of what I call the niche firms that are doing management. There are a series, I think we're going to see three kinds of firms in this country. We're going to see the large collaborative, which I believe in, the comprehensive service that can provide the whole thing. We're going to see the development of the niche firm that only does specialized things. But if you think about that issue, they are the people you go to. For instance, golf course architecture has more or less become that. Zoological design, you automatically think of, you think of Jones and Jones, or you think of Coe and Lee. That's it. The niche firms that do something very special. So other comprehensive firms will hire them as a specialist. And then you're going to see what I call the community-rooted firm. This is the young fellow who was back into his favorite town of Norcross, Georgia. He joins the PTA, the Rotary. He's on city council. He's a volunteer. He does pro bono. And anytime anybody says landscape architect or landscape architecture, the only thing that comes to mind is this fellow. And he will service what I call the municipal small-scale account. And I think that if a person likes that lifestyle and that kind of community, then do it and do it well, and it provides the service because they bring their training into that everyday community. That doesn't mean that that firm will probably never do a project more than 50 miles away from home, and they'll probably never do a major project because there aren't major projects in their community. And they may not be that specialist or specialized that they can be classified as a niche firm. So there are three kinds: large, comprehensive, niche, and I think what I call the community-oriented firm. Now, this does not exclude, of course, possibilities of public service, working in public practice or in the educational practice. Yeah. We're also seeing a reasonable number of landscape architects going on and doing graduate work in fields outside of landscape architecture. There have always been a few that have gone on in planning, but now we're seeing some going on in forestry because forest recreation, so forth, is of real interest. Think of Catherine Dunster and people of that nature. And we're seeing I've always seen a few go on in business, MBAs, and they wind up managing firms, either professional consulting firms or other kinds of things, in land law, in real estate law. And I think we're going to see, and we've always seen a few go into architecture and so forth, but we're seeing people an attitude change. They don't feel they're leaving the field, they feel they're adding to it. Historically, if you went to another field, it was considered leaving the field, and that's not the case, because you can practice landscape architecture if you're the mortgage manager for a national bank. Not in the traditional sense, but you are a landscape architect, and your value system and decision-making is going to be influenced by that training. So I see a real future. And I think that if properly done, undergraduate training in landscape architecture is a decent education, even if you never practice landscape architecture, because it introduces you to what I call the basic humanities, just enough science so that you're dangerous, and frankly, some aesthetic appreciation and a lot of social science and understanding how people function in a relationship. So I think it's a good general education, even if you're going to go back into the family car business.
Yeah, good.
Okay.